All right, here we are once again. Our class is Joshua and Judges for Beginners, from Conquest to Settled Land. This is lesson number 9 in this series, and the title of this lesson is Gideon. We'll be talking about Gideon and his victory and cover the passage from Judges chapter 6 verse 1 to Judges 8 verse 35. So in Judges chapter 6, in the beginning, the first couple of verses, we find that Israel is under severe oppression from the Midianites due to their disobedience to God, that familiar cycle that we spoke of in the previous lesson. Here, for 7 years, the Israelites are subjected to raids and invasions by the Midianites, who along with the Amalekites and other eastern tribes devastate the land. The Midianites would come in large numbers. They would overwhelm Israel and destroy the crops and the livestock and reduce the Israelites to hiding in caves and in various strongholds. This constant pressure leads Israel to cry out to the Lord for help. Again, another stop in that familiar cycle. In response, God sends a prophet to explain the reason for their suffering. The prophet reminds Israel of how God had delivered them from Egypt and given them the land of Canaan, but they had not obeyed his commands. Always the same idea that their situation in the land of Canaan, their success there depended on their faithfulness and not necessarily their size or their military strength. And so instead of worshiping and following God, they turned to the gods of the Amorites, leading to their current distress. Of course, two main reasons for Israel's constant and repeated oppression. First, disobedience to God's command. Israel's fundamental issue was their disobedience to God. Despite the many times that God had delivered them from oppression in the past, the problem was that Israel repeatedly fell into the pattern of abandoning God's covenant and turning to the worship of foreign gods, including the Baals. We talked about that last week, the Baals and the gods of the Amorites. Of course, as a result of their idolatry and rebellion, God allowed them to be oppressed by the Midianites as a form of his judgment on them. This reflects the cycle seen throughout the book of Judges. Israel sins, faces the consequences through oppression, that cry out to God for help, and then experience deliverance from God's hand. Another reason for their oppression, and that was idolatry and assimilation with Canaanite practices. The Israelites failed to heed God's warnings to avoid adopting the practices and the gods of the surrounding nations. And we spoke last time about the pressures they were under, the peer pressure of taking into their daily lives the habit of worshiping the local gods. Of course, despite God's command to worship him and him alone, they assimilated with the Canaanites and adopted their religious practices, which involved idol worship, and of course this was the turning away from the Lord. Their turning to the gods of the Amorites, whom God had driven out before them, led to the withdrawal of God's protection and the subsequent dominion or domination of the Midianites over them. And so the prophet sent by God in Judges chapter 6 verses 8 to 10 specifically rebukes Israel for not listening to God's command and choosing instead to follow these foreign gods. And so Israel's oppression under the Midianites was a direct consequence of their disobedience and their idolatry. By failing to remain faithful to the covenant and turning to the gods of the nations around them, they experienced the loss of God's protection and blessing, leading to their suffering. This passage here that we spoke of, Judges chapter 6, verse 8 to 10, serves as a reminder of the importance of covenant faithfulness and the dangers of abandoning God's commands, which, by the way, is true today. we also are in danger of abandoning the covenant we have with God, that we are faithful to Him and He protects us, He maintains our salvation. So it's the same, essential things are necessary for us today in our world to maintain God's blessing and God's protection. And so we continue with Judges chapter 6, verses 11 to 27. A summary of this. This is a narrative. This happens, this happens, this happens. This is a summary, a narrative rather, and what I want to give you is simply a summary of this narrative with perhaps some information, extra information. So we begin with the angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord appears to Gideon while he's threshing wheat in a winepress in order to hide the wheat from the Midianites. The angel addresses Gideon as mighty warrior and tells him that the Lord is with him. What's interesting is that Gideon's location and activity reflect Israel's fear and desperation under Midianite oppression. Threshing wheat in a winepress, a location typically used for pressing grapes, was an effort to hide from the Midianite raiders. Despite Gideon's apparent fearfulness, God sees potential in him and of course addresses him as mighty warrior, indicating what Gideon would become under God's empowerment. Of course, Gideon is not sure. He has questions, he has doubts. So he responds to the angel of the Lord with doubt, questioning why Israel is suffering if the Lord is truly with them. Typical human reaction. If God is with us, where is God when we need Him? That was his basic response to the angel. He recalls the stories of God's past deliverances like the Exodus from Egypt, but he laments the idea that the Lord seems to have abandoned them. The Lord, that's what He did for us in the past, but where is He now? What has He done for us lately? So Gideon's response shows, of course, his lack of faith and his despair. He does acknowledge God's past works and his current circumstances lead him to doubt God's care in the present time. Maybe God did these things in the past, but right now He doesn't seem to be doing anything for us. This, of course, highlights the theme of faith and trust in God's timing and God's plans. And so the Lord turns to Gideon and commands him to go in the strength that you have and save Israel from the Midianites. And so Gideon expresses doubt, citing his own weakness and his low status as a member of the weakest clan in Manasseh, the tribe of Manasseh, and he is the least in his own family. And so God reassures him with the promise, I will be with you and you will strike down the Midianites, leaving none alive. That's God's promise to Gideon. So God calls Gideon despite his feelings of inadequacy, reminding him that success will come not from his own strength, but it'll come from God's presence. This mirrors the biblical theme that God often uses seemingly weak or unlikely individuals to accomplish His purposes, demonstrating that the source of strength is God and not human capability. In the next section, Gideon seeks a sign in Judges chapter 6, verses 17 to 21. Gideon, still unsure, asks for a sign to confirm that the angel of the Lord is truly speaking to him. It's not just some sort of dream or hallucination that he's having. And so he prepares a meal, a young goat and some unleavened bread and broth, and he brings it as an offering. The angel instructs him to place the food on a rock. The angel then touches the offering with the tip of his staff, and fire consumes the offering, and it is followed by the angel disappearing into the flame. And so Gideon's request for a sign shows his cautious faith and need for assurance. And that's not a bad thing. He's a cautious man. A lot of things have happened to shake his faith. And so he needs some reassurance. The miraculous consumption of the offering by fire serves as a divine confirmation of God's call and presence. In other words, I'm not crazy, I really did see this happen with my own eyes. This event highlights Gideon's growing but still tentative faith and God's willingness, this is the part that I like, God's willingness to provide these things, to help him believe. You know, the man who said to Jesus, I believe, but help my disbelief. You know, there are a lot of people like that. Even in our own lives, we need help to believe. And in this case, we see God helping Gideon to believe. And so after this, we see that Gideon realizes that he has seen the angel of the Lord face to face, and he fears for his life, believing that seeing God will result in his death. However, the Lord, once again, reassures him, saying, peace, do not be afraid, you're not going to die. In response, Gideon builds an altar to the Lord and names it, the Lord is peace, Yahweh Shalom. And so Gideon's fear of seeing God reflects a common biblical theme that encountering the divine could result in death. We read about that in Exodus chapter 33, verse 20. God's assurance of peace transforms Gideon's fear into worship, leading him to establish an altar to memorialize the encounter and God's promise of peace. The naming of the altar emphasizes God's peaceful nature in the midst of Israel's turmoil. And so God requests something of Gideon at this point to test his faith. That night, God commands Gideon to destroy his father's altar to Baal and to cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Gideon is to build an altar to the Lord in its place and sacrifice one of his father's bulls on it, using the wood from the Asherah pole for the fire. And so Gideon obeys, but because he is afraid of his family and the townspeople, he performs this act at night. So this is Gideon's first act of obedience based on faith, but it's done cautiously and it's done in secret. It reflects his continued struggle with fear, yet also his willingness to follow God's commands despite the potential backlash from his family and the community. He had a reason to be afraid. And so destroying the altar of Baal was a bold rejection of the idolatry that had plagued Israel, indicating the beginning of spiritual restoration through Gideon's leadership. A couple of observations about this particular passage, first of which, God's selection of the unlikely. God always picks the most unlikely people to do His work. He chooses individuals who seem weak or unqualified by worldly standards to carry out His purposes. Gideon's low status and feelings of inadequacy do not disqualify him from being God's chosen leader. And this idea, this theme, if you wish, is prevalent throughout the Bible, and it shows that it is God's presence that empowers His people for great tasks and not their own strength. Another observation is the need for reassurance and growth in faith. Gideon's request for a sign and his fear throughout this passage reflect his human weaknesses and doubts. However, God is patient with Gideon, giving him the signs and assurance he needed to build his faith. Gideon's gradual growth in faith mirrors the journey that many believers experience when trust in God deepens through successive acts of obedience. You want to demonstrate your faith? Obey God. Sometimes it's easy to obey God, sometimes it's a little more difficult. The more difficulty required in obedience, the greater our faith grows when we respond. And so a third observation was the importance of private acts of obedience before there could be public leadership. Before Gideon can lead Israel into battle against the Midianites, he must first demonstrate his faithfulness in private by tearing down his father's altar to Baal. This act signifies the spiritual preparation that often precedes public ministry or leadership. Gideon's first test is to confront idolatry, not in the nation. His first test is to confront idolatry in his own family and in his own community, laying the groundwork for larger victories that will come later on. Of course, the people react to what Gideon has done. The next morning, the townspeople discover that the altar of Baal has been torn down and the Asherah pole cut down, and a bull has been sacrificed on an altar to the Lord. And of course, they're outraged and immediately seek to find out who has done this thing. After investigating, they discover that Gideon is responsible for the destruction of the altar, and so the townspeople demand that Gideon be brought out to be killed for desecrating the altar of Baal and defying the worship of their local deity. If you remember correctly, I mentioned to you previously that Baal, the Baal god had local, there was a local god. You had the Baal god of one town and the god Baal of another town, or of an area or of a region. So there were many Baal gods. So they were upset that he had desecrated the altar of their local Baal god. And so surprisingly, we find out that Gideon's father, Joash, defends him. He challenges the people's faith in Baal by asking, will you contend for Baal or will you save him? In other words, Joshua argues that if Baal is truly a god, he should be able to defend himself and take revenge on the one who destroyed his altar. And of course, we find out because of Joash's defense, Gideon is given the nickname Jerubbaal, which means let Baal contend against him, implying that Baal should take action if he is a true God. This shows his father Joash's shift from allegiance to Baal to supporting his son's actions. Now, right after this, the scene shifts, and we see that the Midianites and the allies of the Midianites prepare for battle in Judges chapter 6, verses 33. So in response to Gideon's growing influence, the Midianites, the Amalekites, and other eastern peoples unite, and they cross the Jordan River, encamping in the valley of Jezreel, ready to attack Israel. Empowered by the Spirit of the Lord, Gideon blows the trumpet and he summons the Abiezrites, his clan, to follow him. He also sends messengers to the tribes of Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, calling them to join the fight against the Midianites. So a couple of key observations here. First of all, Joash's shift in loyalty. Joash, Gideon's father, his defense of his son marks a significant turning point. Despite being the owner of the altar, he questions the power of Baal and he sides with his son. This shift reflects a broader movement away from Baal worship, crystallized by Gideon's bold actions. And also we see God's empowerment, continued empowerment of Gideon himself. The passage emphasizes the empowerment of Gideon by the Spirit of the Lord. Despite the initial opposition from his community, Gideon gains support as he prepares to lead Israel in battle against the Midianites, demonstrating God's favor and the beginning of Gideon as a national leader. In our next section, Gideon once again asks for signs from the Lord. Judges chapter 6, 36 to 40. So after being called by God to lead Israel against the Midianites, Gideon still seeks reassurance from God that he will indeed deliver Israel through him. He still has trouble believing that he will have success. So he asks for two signs using fleece of wool, if you wish, to confirm God's promise. The first sign, Gideon asked God to prove his promise by performing a miracle with a fleece. He requests that the fleece be wet with dew in the morning while the ground around it remain dry. And so God grants Gideon's request. When Gideon wakes up in the next morning, he finds that the fleece is soaked with dew, while the ground is dry. And he wrings out enough water from the fleece to fill a bowl, which confirms that the miracle truly has taken place. Then he asks for a second sign. Despite this first sign, he asks for another test, but this time he reverses the conditions. This time he asks for the fleece to remain dry while the ground around it is wet with dew. And again, as we see, God grants this request. The next morning, the ground is covered with dew, but the fleece is completely dry. Again, a couple of observations. Gideon's repeated request for signs shows his continued hesitancy and need for reassurance, despite already being called by God and empowered by the Spirit. This reflects both his human weakness and his desire to be absolutely certain of God's will. Have we never had that experience in the modern day? Have we never offered a prayer to God saying, Lord, I want to do your will with all my heart. I want to do your will, but I'm not sure what it is. Please show me what it is that you want me to do. Well, this is where Gideon is in his relationship with God and carrying out God's will. And then the other observation is about God's patience. Even though Gideon requests repeated miracles, some could see this as a lack of faith, but God is patient with him. By granting both signs, God reassures Gideon and demonstrates his willingness to work through Gideon's doubts in order to confirm his divine plan. And so this episode highlights Gideon's cautious faith and God's gracious confirmation of his promises as Gideon prepares to take on the immense task of delivering Israel from the Midianites. And that brings us to chapter 7. So let's do a summary of chapter 7, shall we? And so we see Gideon's army being reduced. The army, initially 32,000 strong, is reduced by God in two phases. First, those who are afraid are allowed to leave. And when they do, that reduces the army to 10,000 people, 10,000 men. Then God instructs Gideon to conduct a kind of a water drinking test, further reducing the army to 300 men. Now the purpose is to ensure that Israel does not take credit for the victory, but will attribute their victory solely to God. God is interested not only in building Gideon's faith, but he also wants to build the faith of the people as well. And so at night, God tells Gideon to go to the Midianite camp for reassurance. Gideon overhears a Midianite soldier recounting a dream where a barley loaf tumbles into the Midianite camp, overturning a tent. The dream is interpreted by another soldier to mean that Gideon will defeat the Midianites. Encouraged by this, Gideon worships God and prepares for battle. And so Gideon divides his 300 men into 3 companies, equipping each man with a trumpet, an empty jar, a clay jar, and a torch. They surround the Midianite camp at night, and following Gideon's lead, they blow their trumpets, they break their jars, and they shout, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." This action creates confusion in the Midianite camp, causing them to turn on each other in a panic. The Midianites flee, and the Israelites pursue, eventually capturing 2 Midianite princes, Oreb and Zeeb, and securing a decisive victory. And so God's sovereignty, we see God's sovereignty in this deliverance. This passage highlights how God orchestrates victory through improbable means. I mean, by reducing the army to just 300 men and then using unconventional weapons, trumpets and jars and torches, God ensures that Israel understands that their victory is not by their own strength, but by His power. And of course, it also illustrates God's ability to deliver His people in ways that defy human expectations. In chapter 8, verses 1 to 21, we have the unusual account of Gideon's conflict with Ephraim, the tribe of Ephraim, and Zebah and Zalmunna. And so we begin with the conflict with the tribe of Ephraim. So after the victory over the Midianites, the tribe of Ephraim confronts Gideon angrily. They're upset because they were not called earlier to join the fight against the Midians. Feeling left out of the glory of the battle, the Ephraimites had a prominent position in Israel and likely felt insulted for not being initially involved in the military campaign. Instead of confronting their anger directly, Gideon uses diplomacy. He praises the Ephraimites for their role in capturing two Midianite princes, Oreb and Zeeb, highlighting that their contribution was significant. He also compares their victory to his, downplaying his own role in the battle. And of course we see that this flattery and diplomacy cool Ephraim's anger, and the potential conflict is averted. This episode highlights Gideon's wisdom and leadership in managing potential internal conflicts within Israel. Even when you win the war, there are problems with jealousy and pride. And so despite the military victory over Midian, disunity among the tribes could have threatened the stability of Israel. Then we see the pursuit of Zebah and Zalmunna in chapter Judges 8, verses 4 to 12. Gideon and his 300 men continue pursuing the Midianite kings, Zebah and Zalmunna, who are fleeing with the remnants of their army. They reach the towns of Succoth and Penuel, both located east of the Jordan River. Gideon asks the leaders of these towns for food and supplies to sustain his men so that they can continue the pursuit of their enemies. But both towns refuse, fearing retaliation from Zebah and Zalmunna should Gideon fail to capture them. So they're playing the odds here. Offended by their refusal to help, Gideon vows to return and punish both towns once he captures the Midianite kings. Gideon continues his pursuit, and with God's help, he captures the two Midianite kings, defeating the remaining Midianite forces. Now, the refusal of Succoth and Penuel to aid Gideon reflects the fracturing of loyalty and the fear of retribution from powerful enemies. This shows the lack of unity and trust in God's deliverance within Israel, as even the Israelites hesitated to support, not all of them, but some of the Israelites hesitated to support their own leader and one who had gained a great victory. So this demonstrates the frame of mind of the people at that time. They were distrustful, they were not united. We read then about the retribution against these towns and the death of Zebah and Zalmunna, Judges 8, 13 to 21. So upon returning victorious, Gideon confronts the elders of Succoth and Penuel. He captures the elders of Succoth and punishes them by whipping them with thorns and briars as he had promised. He then destroys the tower of Penuel and kills the men of the city as retribution for their refusal to support him. And so Gideon then questions Zebah and Zalmunna about the killing of his brothers at Tabor. The Midianite kings confirm that they were responsible for the deaths, describing Gideon's brothers as resembling Gideon himself, royal and dignified. Gideon, seeking personal justice for the murder of his family, orders his young son, Jether, to execute the kings. However, Jether hesitates due to fear, and so Gideon himself kills Zebah and Zalmunna. This episode reveals a more personal, almost vengeful side of Gideon. His actions go beyond the military mission of delivering Israel from the Midianite oppression. By punishing the towns of Succoth and Penuel and avenging his brothers' deaths, Gideon acts out of personal retribution, which introduces a more complex and human side to his character, which is not in submission to God's will. These issues foreshadow the increasing moral and social fragmentation in Israel during the time of the judges in general. Our next section is in chapter 8, verses 22 to 35. First of all, Israel's offer of kingship to Gideon. After the great victory over the Midianites, the Israelites asked Gideon to become their king and to establish a dynasty, requesting that he and then his son and his grandson rule over them. Gideon, to his credit, refuses the offer of kingship, stating that the Lord will rule over you. This response reflects the biblical principle that God is Israel's true ruler and that human kingship is not God's design for Israel at this particular time. And now it's almost an aside here, but we see another facet of Gideon's personality. Although Gideon refuses the kingship, he asks the Israelites for gold from the spoils of war. With this gold, he creates an ephod, which is a kind of a priestly garment or object. This ephod becomes a stumbling block for Israel as it is worshipped and leads them into idolatry. Despite his initial rejection of kingship, Gideon inadvertently creates an object of idolatry, undermining his earlier devotion to God. The ephod becomes a symbol of Israel's spiritual downfall as it diverts the people's worship away from God. And I'm always curious about this particular episode, almost out of character for Gideon, who had zeal to know and to do God's will. He asks for the gold, which is normal, the spoils of war, but then he creates an ephod. A little more information about that. An ephod in ancient Israel was a priestly garment, long garment that the priests wore, and it was often associated with seeking God's guidance. The ephod that Gideon made seems to have become a religious object with negative consequences. The text indicates that it became a snare to Gideon and his family as the people of Israel began to worship it, leading them away from proper worship of God. And so my question was, as I read this, and there was no more information in the text, why did Gideon do this? What possible reasons could he have done this? And I have a couple here, a couple of reasons. Again, I say the Bible does not give precise motives for Gideon's decision to make the ephod, but there are a few possible reasons that I share. First, the religious significance. Gideon may have intended the ephod as a symbol of God's victory over the Midianites, connecting it to religious worship or commemoration, just like he built an altar, right? He built an altar where his father had the Baal altar. He built another altar there as a way to worship God. Perhaps he created this as his own design to memorialize the victory over the Midianites. It could also have been something to do with a personal legacy. It may have been a way for Gideon to memorialize his achievements, though this ultimately led the people into idolatry. Like this ephod, he wasn't wearing it. This ephod was in his home and like a trophy. Think of a trophy. This represents the great victory that I led the people of Israel over the Midianites. And it could have been a substitute for the tabernacle. The ephod might have been made as an alternative for seeking God's will, though it was not in line with the proper priestly function. The point I'm making here is that Gideon himself was making up a religious connotation for the golden ephod. The idea being either to memorialize or as a trophy or as a religious symbol. The problem being that God had not asked him to do this. And there was nothing in the law that suggested that one had to do this in order to honor God or to thank Him for any help. In any case, the ephod, as we know, became a stumbling block for Israel, leading them into idolatrous practices. This episode highlights the tension between Gideon's faithfulness to God and the unintended consequences of his actions. He may have thought that he was doing something good. He may have thought this could be a rallying point here for the people, reminding them of God's, what God had done. But instead, it turned out to become an object of stumbling because the people didn't see it as a memorial. They saw it as something to worship. Of course, in chapter 8, verses 28 to 32, we have Gideon's legacy and death. Israel experiences peace for 40 years during Gideon's lifetime, marking a period of stability and rest from their enemies. Gideon has many wives and 70 sons. He also has a son named Abimelech by a concubine from Shechem. Keep that name in mind because he will figure very strongly in the future. And so after a long life, Gideon dies and is buried in Ophrah, the town of his family. After Gideon's death, the Israelites quickly turn away from God and begin worshiping Baal Berith. They forget the Lord's deliverance and they fail to show loyalty or gratitude to Gideon's family. This marks a return to the cycle of apostasy and idolatry, highlighting the instability and the spiritual decline of Israel, even after periods of deliverance. 40 years of peace, you think that they would have understood. We have peace because we're obeying God. All right, 2 modern day lessons from this section. Actually, a negative lesson and a positive lesson. We'll start with the negative lesson first. The danger of spiritual drifting. Gideon's story illustrates how even well-meaning leadership can inadvertently lead people astray. After Gideon's victory over the Midianites, as I mentioned, he created an ephod that became an object of idolatry for Israel. And so despite his initial rejection of kingship, one of a personal high point in his life and his leadership, Gideon's actions led to spiritual confusion and disobedience. And so the Israelites quickly returned to worshiping false gods after his death, showing how easily people can drift away from God when they lose their focus on true worship. The modern application is that today we must be vigilant about avoiding modern day idols. Anything that takes the place of God in our hearts, whether they be material wealth or power, status or personal achievements. Even good things like traditions or leadership structures can become harmful when they distract us from worshiping God wholeheartedly and worshiping God in a way that is not prescribed in the New Testament. And then we have a positive lesson. And the positive lesson is that Gideon's initial response to God's call was one of fear and self-doubt, yet God chose him to deliver Israel from the Midianites. In other words, God uses the weak and the unlikely for his purposes. Despite his feelings of inadequacy, God assured Gideon that his presence would be enough. The victory of Gideon's small army of 300 men over a much larger Midianite force demonstrates that God works powerfully through those who are willing to trust them, even in their weaknesses. It's not like God said to Gideon, you have to get over your weaknesses, you have to get over your fear, you have to be feeling strong and confident and so on and so forth before I use you. No. As long as you're going forward knowing that you are going forward in God's power, then God can work through you. As I said, this teaches us that God can use anyone, no matter how inadequate they may feel, to accomplish great things. In a world that often values strength and power and self-sufficiency, this story reminds us that reliance on God is what brings true success. When facing challenges, believers can take heart knowing that God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. And He is able to use us for His purposes, regardless of our perceived limitations. All right, well that's the lesson on Gideon. Our assignment, here we go. I would ask you to reread Judges chapter 6 to 8, and then read ahead, because next time we'll do Judges chapter 9 to 12. As I said at the beginning, you do the reading at home and we'll do the explaining here in class. That's it for today. Thank you very much for your attention. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.